All right. Hello, everyone. I hope that your week has been going well, and thank you all for joining us for the Center for Art Law's workshop on Provenance Research. My name is Manali Manukyan, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Art Law. And again, thank you all for joining us. You will see on your screen, there is a poll for you to fill out. As we talk about the center and introduce ourselves, we hope that this will be a chance for us to get a little bit more information about you and for us to get to know you. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Center for Art Law, we are a research and education organization dedicated to offering resources and programming for the advancement of a vibrant arts and law community worldwide. We do this through our newsletter, our website, and the events. And we use these all to disseminate information and keep our audience updated on art law related news, programs, cases, publications, and even more. The center facilitates conversations by hosting and participating in events such as today. And we also have a really great internship program that allows students to get firsthand education and experience in art and cultural heritage law. The center has a bunch of events coming up on its near horizon that we hope that you will be able to see you all at. Coming up at the end of this month is going to be our Artist Legacy and Estate Planning Clinic. If you're an artist that's interested in setting up your estate or figuring out steps for that, we invite you to join us there. We also have a workshop on licensing and negotiation coming up in April, a CLE on ADA and privacy issues coming up at the end of this month as well, and even more coming up in our near future. We also invite you to become a premium member if you enjoy today's event and want discounts to other workshops and art law lunch talks in the future. We offer discounted access to our premium members, and these members also get the chance to go through and look through our archive of events, our articles, our case law corner, and catch up on all things art law related. And as we go forward, I will introduce our managing and founding director, Irina Tarsis.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Can I close the poll? I think, well, we got 19 out of 26 participants. We would really love to know where you're all coming from, professionally and geographically. So 5 more seconds for the poll. It seems that we have pretty much an equal number of people who have attended our events in the past and who are first-time visitors to the center. So welcome back and welcome to the newcomers. Most of you are in Northeast of the United States. A few people are outside of the United States, and we have very few attorneys. So as you probably have gathered, depending on the subject of our programs and events, we attract either more artists or lawyers or experts on each of these disciplines. From the questions, you can see that we have done another workshop on provenance research, and we have a couple people returning for the workshop, but most of the participants are first-time workshop participants. So we will be sending you a follow-up about this experience. Hopefully many of you will participate, and we do look forward to your feedback. All right, so what else can I tell you about you before I tell you more about the center? One person has never done provenance research. One person is an expert. I would love for the expert to maybe put their name into the chat so we can maybe ask them for some comments towards the end of the program. And then the rest are somewhat familiar with provenance research work and very familiar. All right. Thank you for participating in the, in the poll. Let's go back to our slides. All right. As Manelli mentioned, the center is doing a lot of good work. We've been doing good work for more than a decade, and I'm grateful to all the guests and all the experts who have come to the center. I'm very grateful to Aubrey for being our expert in the house today. And my special thanks to Manelli for organizing this event and for working on the handout and making sure that everything runs smoothly despite the events that are distracting so many of us and hurting so many of us. So I encourage you, if you haven't yet, to join the center's paying membership cohort. There are benefits, I kid you not. And the image that I chose for this is, it's a siege of a city that's being sieged right now. There's a lot of provenance research work that has been done and will be done in the future in connection to events worldwide. So we'll talk about Ukraine because we can't not talk about Ukraine, but we're going to start with this subject. Who owns Scythian gold? Some of you probably have heard of Scythian gold, and I hope some of you haven't, because it's not necessarily something that everybody comes across on a daily basis. The dispute about these objects found in Crimea that were displayed in museums in Crimea and were lent to museums in the Netherlands came about in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. It was a very interesting case where artworks were loaned to a museum with an agreement saying the artworks have to, or objects have to come back to the country from which they came and to the museums from which they came. So it became a problem for the borrowing institutions because they couldn't figure out where to send the objects back, to the country that lent them or to the institutions that lent them. So the question of provenance was and remains quite important in this case. And if you're interested in reading more about it, we'll be happy to share information with you about it. So Scythian gold, quite old artifacts found in different periods of time in 19th century, 20th century, and have been making headlines and making curators and lawyers very concerned about ownership of these objects. Another example that I wanted to share with you, which deals with provenance quite squarely, is a lawsuit that was pending for more than a decade. It involved Norton Simon Museum in California. The case was brought by the heirs of a dealer who owned this diptych before World War II. The work is quite valuable according to the market. It's quite valuable according to art historians. These are two works by Lucas Cranach, Adam and Eve, and their provenance before 1917 revolution, they were in Ukraine. How did they get to Ukraine? We still don't know, but we know that after the Russian Revolution, a lot of property was nationalized from both private families and from institutions, particularly religious institutions. They were, some ended up in museums and some were nationalized and taken into national museums, and some were sold to raise funds for the budget of the new government. So these two works were sold in Berlin in 1931. They were acquired by a very well-to-do prominent dealer from the Netherlands who happened to be Jewish, who was targeted by the Nazis immediately after Germans went into the Netherlands. And so the story of this diptych is very long, starts circa 1520s. And the provenance research that went into figuring out who and how had claims to this, to these two works were very, very important for the case that was heard in California. Again, this is a very well-known case, and it has a lot of connections in different locations and in connections to different historical events. Finally, to put you in the mindset of provenance work and how institutions are interacting with each other based on origins of the objects, the headlines from yesterday from the art newspaper. What will happen to Russian treasures on loan in London and Paris? In one institution in Paris, there is an exhibition of Impressionist paintings from two Russian museums, but they are also from private collections that were nationalized after the revolution. And the painting by Renoir from 1877 is property of the Pushkin Museum. You can see if you go on the Pushkin Museum website, there's very little provenance given there. You know that it's an oil and very important. This object is at the Pushkin Museum since 1948. It was painted in 1877, so something must have happened between these two dates. And we know that it's from a collection that was nationalized after the revolution. All right, so to put things in perspective, we have an expert in-house who does a lot of provenance research work. We have tasked her with looking at less common objects to research or harder objects to research. And Aubrey kindly accepted the invitation. She will talk to us about strategies, about steps to take when you are handling a work of art or an antiquity or a sculpture. And there are different reasons why we conduct provenance research. We're not only doing it for litigation purposes, we're doing it for different purposes. So I'm very grateful for Aubrey's time, and I'm very grateful for everybody's participation. I'll moderate, meaning I'll take care of, well, I'll see what kind of questions you post and try to provide resources together with Manelli and the rest of the center's team. Please put your questions into the chat, and we will have a little bit of time at the end of the presentation for a group presentation. So for those of you who have not subscribed yet, this is a slide that we'll take down. So read our newsletter if you wish, attend our events as often as you care to. And I'm showing you a picture of Kiev in the not so distant past. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be rebuilt if need be in hopefully near peaceful future. All right, Aubrey, you are up.
Well, thank you for that lovely intro, Irina, and thanks everybody for coming today. So what I thought I could do is give a little bit of extra background about myself in case anybody has not read my bio, and then we'll kind of take it from there, and I'll switch over to my slides. So really, I've been working as an art historian, an appraiser, and a provenance researcher for about a decade now. I earned my master's degree from the University of College London in history of art, where I specialized in versos, or the backs of paintings, and the documented histories of art objects. I come from an art gallery and academic research background, and I founded my company, Proper Provenance, to help provide my clients with the tools not only to historically contextualize art, but also to shed light on attribution and legal title within the international art market. So within the confines of this business, you know, I've worked on, or throughout my career, I've worked on artworks, including paintings, artifacts, works on paper, prints, and sculptures, basically spanning the 4th century BC through to the 21st century. I will note that I don't usually work on antiquities by myself, but I have worked on them with nonprofits in the past and definitely have a lot of context in that world. So if there are any questions that come up about antiquities, I'll do my best to answer them, but also may be able to give you better resources to help you answer the questions that you may have. So really, in today's talk, I will be focusing predominantly on using Western painting as my point of reference, but I would like everybody to keep in mind that the methodology we'll be discussing is applicable to art of all eras, mediums, and price points. And as Irina mentioned, please, go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and I'm eager to answer as many of them as I can. And then just to give you guys a little outline of today's workshop, I'd like to start with some of the basics, or what I like to call my go-to basics of how to read and analyze provenance. This way we can kind of make sure that everyone is operating on the same page for the rest of the presentation. From there, we will look at some of the risks art market actors may face when they're dealing with provenance before moving into some real life examples. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Okay, great. So the best place I think for us to start is to
let's start with the definition of provenance right off the bat. How is it defined? So the International Council of Museums, their code of ethics defines provenance as the full history and ownership of an item from the time of its discovery or creation to the present day, through which authenticity and ownership are determined. Now, I think that this is an important definition for everyone to keep in mind as we move forward, because in my experience, when people talk about provenance, it's usually seen as kind of, a quote unquote bulleted list of dead people or previous owners that appears as a formality when you're completing an art transaction. But it is far more than just knowing who the owners are. It gives us a lot more information about the artwork itself, the historical context in which that piece is created or in which that piece has traversed the market, as well as better understandings of art historical interpretations of the pieces as well. So in close keeping with the definition of provenance, let's also clarify the definition of clean title. So ICOM again defines clean title as the indisputable right to ownership of property supported by full provenance of the item since discovery or creation or production, And digging in a bit more, I think it's important to note that legal definitions of clean title can vary by jurisdiction or country. So for example, in New York City, where I currently live, a stolen object can rarely, if ever, gain clean title. So this means that if an artwork was stolen at any point in its history, regardless of whether or not the current owner was responsible for that theft, they may not be considered the legal or rightful owner of the artwork. And in other locations, such as Italy, they have civil codes that dictate clean title can be earned if certain criteria are met. So what that is to say is also we have to pay attention to what jurisdiction are you conducting your provenance research in? Is the provenance research acceptable for it? It may be acceptable for the jurisdiction in which you've conducted the research, but it may not be acceptable for the jurisdiction in which you look to sell an artwork in the future. So those are all things to keep in mind. Now, let's move into our go-to basics. So unfortunately, there is no universal standard for recording provenance. So you might be wondering, Aubrey, how do I decipher any of this? So as I mentioned, that bulleted list, let's first think about how that's usually formatted. So that list of owners is usually formatted from oldest to newest, where we have point of creation at the top and the most recent owner at the bottom. That's just kind of to get your bearings of reading that list. Now, each line of that list should provide you with the name or location of the owner with any available dates to indicate the duration of ownership and when it was transferred to the next owner. This can obviously be quite tricky, as it's often difficult to pin down exact dates supported by verifiable information. And most institutions format their provenance slightly differently. So we may see a reliance on punctuation in a somewhat similar fashion across institutional records to indicate transfers of ownership. So examples could be that we'll see a semicolon indicating that a work has passed directly between two names. And by that, I mean, if we see John Doe, California, semicolon, followed by Jane Doe, New York, that will indicate that semicolon indicates to us that John Doe sold the artwork directly to Jane Doe and that we have corroborated proof of that. Now, a period in that same situation is used to separate the two owners if a direct transfer did not occur or is not known to have occurred. So with these reading tools in mind, let's switch over to the analysis part of this. So first, I want to touch upon verifiable documentation. What does it mean and how do I know if I have it? So basically, this is documentation that proves or corroborates the bulleted list of previous owners, exhibitions, or literature entries tied to a specific work, right? So that is documentation that specifically references the artwork or collection being researched, such as bills of sale, inventory records, estate records, any sort of archival records, something that is going to tie the artwork to the owner. Similarly, we also want to think about how provenance entries full of mentions of private collection and private dealer without any supporting documentation can cause problems for us down the road, because technically it's not reliable or verifiable record of ownership or authenticity. Now, that can also be a tricky point, which we might touch on a little later, but we also want to make sure that if we're working with clients, we're still maintaining that level of discretion that most of the art market will be looking for. So it is a fine line to walk of making sure that you're sharing documentation with a piece as it moves through the market without necessarily giving away too much information about the client you might be working with. Now, where the question of clean title is concerned, it is often the associated paperwork that's going to allow us to make a provenance-related determination or assess the situation. So we want to keep in mind the difference between historical research methodology and provenance research methodology as we're talking about how to research artworks. Historical research on its own can definitely be quite unbounded. So someone might be interested in learning more about a particular subject, person, or question. You might scour archives and libraries looking to find an answer, but even if you don't find quite the answer that you're looking for, an analysis can often be crafted out of the findings or lack thereof. Conversely, the scope of provenance research is often incredibly singular. With this research, you're looking for concrete results, verifiable documentation that references the artwork or collection being researched. And without this, your scope of work cannot necessarily be met. And you can't make, accurate assessments about the artwork's clean title or ownership history. Then from there, let's take a second to talk about the big question, which is always gaps in ownership. The main question I am often asked is, when should I do more research into a gap in ownership? And my answer is always. Because from my experience, there seems to be a preoccupation with thinking that disconcerting gaps in ownership are almost exclusively related to Holocaust era assets or older artworks. And while World War II related gaps are definitely and incredibly vital to flesh out, if possible, gaps can also arise from various other situations. For example, a gap might reflect that someone does not have the right to sell work. How can we look at that? So perhaps it's part of an unsettled divorce proceeding or some other form of litigation. Perhaps there's a loan against the artwork, or perhaps someone owns that artwork with a group of other people and they're trying to sell it without permission from the entire group. So all of these things play into having a good understanding of the gap and a good story to help you understand why there may be a gap. Lastly, I want to touch a little bit upon misconceptions. So with services like fine art title insurance, art fair vetting committees, and commercial databases at our disposal, many of us don't pause to contemplate the implications of buying an artwork with little to no provenance. However, these services are definitely not catch-alls, right? They are due diligence tools that can contribute to your provenance research efforts, but by no means would I suggest that you take one of these and say, okay, I've done my due diligence, I've done my provenance, and that's all I need to do. And on that same vein, I really implore everybody in this workshop to remember to always update your paperwork, right? Because provenance is never static. New information is always coming to light. Databases are constantly updated. So let's say that you've had a piece for 30 years, you did provenance 30 years ago. That doesn't mean that you don't need to do it today. So I encourage people to revisit the provenance of art objects before each appearance on the open market, whether that be a sale, an exhibition, a publication, whatever situation you're in. You want to be prepared for what, if any, new information has emerged since the work's last public appearance. So pushing in a bit more, let's talk about a bit about how we're going to conduct our research. So within the marketplace, we're usually going to start our research process with a certain level of information provided with the artwork. I usually refer to this as the provided provenance, right? And the goal is always to locate verifiable documentation that supports, revises, or expands the ownership history with which you've started. Oftentimes, the easiest place for us to turn is usually the internet. A lot of people think that if something major has happened with an artwork, that Google will show it to us pretty quickly. But this example that I've pulled up here, we can see that I've used my search terms as artist Corot and the artwork Les Petites Dénicheurs. These are screenshots sampling the first page of that Google search, with almost every entry being a third-party site offering reproductions of the painting for sale. So that's mouse pads, mugs, posters, whatever you want. But there is no information about the history of the artwork at all. And this carries on for about 10 pages of the Google search. So my point here is really to say that we want to be careful about how we frame the research that we're doing. We want to make sure that we're looking and following the artwork correctly, as opposed to just saying, how do I do a normal Google search? How would I normally look something up? So of course, for most of us, the most logical place to begin is going to be the catalog raisonné, which is going to give us a quote unquote definitive list of authentic works, often with detailed provenance. Some things to keep in mind when we're thinking about catalog raisonnés: which are the most reputable and when were they published? So I think a good kind of mainstream example to think about here is the Modigliani scandals, right? Most of us know that the Catrone catalog raisonné is considered to be the most definitive record of Modigliani works, considering that later catalogs raisonné have a question of some works, the questioning the authenticity of some of the works that were included. And then we also have a few authentication committees that are being considered reputable now as well. And then at that same time, when we're thinking about the Catrone catalog raisonné, we also have to think about the limitations of that catalog raisonné. And by that, I mean, it's pretty widely known that Catrone created this catalog raisonné of Modigliani works based on works that he had seen in Europe and in person, right? So at the time he's publishing this catalog raisonné, there are works throughout the rest of the world that obviously haven't been included. So then, of course, we have that room and those questions to be asked. So catalog raisonnés, the International Foundation for Art Research, or IFAR, has a wonderful catalogs raisonné search tool on their website to help you sift through the many options and kind of decide which you think would be most reputable. And also, let's remember that catalogs raisonné are tools of authenticity. And as I said, provenance is not always static. So if we're thinking about when that catalog raisonné was published, we also want to compare that to the provenance we're looking at in the 21st century, because that provenance may need to be updated or changed. Then following the catalog raisonné, we want to get into the more time-consuming research of following the people and following the artwork. And by that, I mean tracing people and tracing locations. And as part of these efforts, some of the most common paperwork that you'll probably come across come in the forms of certificates of authenticity and appraisal. So let's take a quick look at how they can play into the provenance process. So certificates of authenticity, right? And I have my little caveat emptor line here, buyer beware, just to kind of make sure that we're raising that red flag when we're thinking about these types of paperwork. So obtaining a certificate of authenticity with your art purchase, whether it be antiquities or early 20th century paintings, whatever it is, often carries the connotation of rightful ownership, and it helps justify purchase. By definition, certificates of authenticity promise exactly what their title suggests, which is authenticity. This means that the purchase object matches the sales floor advertisements with an assertion of artist, date of creation, materials, and possibly source of purchase, and it's a promise that what you bought is real. Now, without proof of authenticity, certain works can become harder to reintroduce into the secondary market, and if you're seeking proof of authenticity for an artwork, provenance definitely plays a factor into that, making sure that you can trace that ownership history, that you respect and don't have any suspicions about the names that are appearing in that ownership history. But you also want to make sure that you are seeking assistance from an expert for that specific artist or medium. And you want to make sure that that information is conveyed by a respected source in the market, because otherwise opinions of authenticity may be rejected by the market as a whole. And I've definitely seen this occur as examples where people have purchased art of varying price points with an opinion of authenticity from someone that they deem to be reputable, but which the market as a whole for that artist does not deem to be reputable. And then when they use that as a point of justification for their sale, or excuse me, for their purchase. But then when they went to sell those items again, the market didn't accept that as proof of authenticity. So then you have that question of, how do I potentially recoup my investment? How do I ensure that the provenance I have is correct? And how do I ensure that the authenticity is correct? And what do I do if it's not? So with that, rarely, if ever, do certificates of authenticity touch upon clean title or ownership histories. So let's take the antiquity pictured here as an example. So according to the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art, or ARCA, an organization which I have definitely worked closely with over the past few years, this piece was seized by US Homeland Security, or more specifically ICE, in 2019. Before the seizure, the work was offered on Live Auctioneers, the online auction platform, with an estimate of $500,000 to $800,000 US. It was described as an impressive Greek marble 3/4 life-size figure of a veiled woman. Okay, that seems to be pretty accurate so far. And the provenance was listed as a Swiss private collection from the 1980s with import document and art loss register certificate. Additionally, the seller indicated on their website, which now no longer exists, that they unconditionally guarantee the authenticity of each of our objects, and each sold work was accompanied by a certificate of authenticity. Now, per ARCA, what becomes a little suspicious here is that veiled statues of this nature do not appear in Greece. Rather, they're often only found in the ancient Greek cemeteries of the ancient cities of Cyrenaica, excuse my pronunciation there, which is part of modern day Libya. To that end, the auction record and the provenance has no note of an export license, which would be required as for a Libyan artifact of this nature to leave the country legally. So here we see very little verifiable documentation augmented by a promise of authenticity. However, we are again noting that authenticity, that promise of authenticity alone, is not enough to verify your provenance or protect your ownership of an item. So then the second question that comes into play often is the appraisal. And I think appraisals are great if you're working as a provenance researcher. I think appraisals are a great starting point for your provenance research, a great source for you to find that provided provenance for you to work from. I think it's important to note that most USPAP compliant appraisal reports will indicate that the appraiser is not an authenticator and that their report does not comment on authenticity, attribution, clean title, provenance, etc., unless there is a specific reason for them to do so in assigning an opinion of value. Now, that's not to say that due diligence will not be conducted for every appraisal, because it definitely should. But when I'm wearing my appraisal hat, I do like to make sure that clients understand the difference between the connotations of an appraisal report and authentication or in-depth investigative provenance research. And from that perspective, we don't want to take any report at face value if it doesn't offer proof of verifiable documentation to support claims of authenticity or ownership history. And that, can come in many forms like citations or reproductions of documentation, but really making sure that you have that trail to support your bulleted list. And this should encompass any report or information you receive on an item, not just an appraisal report. But then kind of taking us back to appraisal reports, I want to note, that provenance can greatly influence an appraisal, right? Because opinions of value assigned in appraisal reports don't necessarily stop with the report, right? They can influence your insurance premiums. They can dictate your estate tax values, or they can help justify transactions. So when we're looking at appraisal reports and when we're working as appraisers as well, we want to make sure that we're looking at what the market demands for a specific work to receive a specific an opinion of value. And of course, not even realizing it, I'm using Modigliani twice here, which is a really blue chip example for me to be talking about, but I think mainstream enough that most of us will have some form of familiarity with it. So this piece here is by the famous forger Elmer Dehori, and it's clearly meant to be passed off as a Modigliani, but I want you to think about, when you're thinking about appraisals and provenance and certificates of authenticity, I want you to think about in your research, what does the market require to justify a Modigliani price tag? And do I have that information at my disposal to support that opinion of value? Now, we'll touch on this a little bit more in our risk assessments portions later. So then the third point that I want to talk about in our kind of buyer beware and thinking about how to frame your research is thinking about provenance traps. So according to No Attorney, provenance traps are traps that use provenance or the documented history of an object to the forger's advantage, as scholars often rely on provenance to determine authenticity and help us build out that bulleted list. And basically, a known object must fit somewhere into the known documented history of an artist's oeuvre in order to be convincing. So in essence, the question of provenance traps, comes down to assessing how reliable is your verifiable documentation and how accurate is the artwork that you're looking at. So according to Charney, right, we have often three types of provenance traps. So one is a fake or a forgery is created to match existing provenance from a lost artwork By that, that's usually going to be that we have a description of an artwork. We don't know its location. We may have measurements, we may not. We might have images, we may not. But basically, it comes down to the fact that the location of that artwork is unknown, and a fake or a forgery of that piece can be recreated so that the piece can be rediscovered. Then 2, we have a forged or faked provenance that may be planted in archives to be discovered by researchers. I would argue that this is probably the most disconcerting trap. And this is partially why I advocate that researchers should, if possible, not rely on a single source to verify your claims. And additionally, it plays into the fact that provenance is only one prong of the authentication process, the others being connoisseurship and scientific testing. So if you are looking to augment claims of authenticity through your provenance research, you want to make sure that you're also considering those other 2 prongs. And then our third trap is when an authentic work is purchased with authentic paperwork. However, a copy of the work is made and the real provenance is used to authenticate the copy. So in essence, the question of provenance traps comes down to assessing, again, how reliable is your documentation and how accurate is the artwork you're looking at. And so these examples that we've just talked about remind us that it's vital to verify your documentation by following the people and following the artwork. And again, by that, I mean making sure that you are framing your research to follow ownership histories and market transactions, not just the information that someone is putting in front of you and saying, this is the provenance, this is the literature reference, and these are the exhibitions. So to kind of push this idea of our caveat emptor full circle, I'd like to talk quickly about the Beltracchi scandal, because I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. It's incredibly salacious, and it serves as an example of a provenance trap and also the importance of verifiable documentation for validating authenticity and transactions. So just a little bit of background for those of you who may not be as familiar. Over the course of 4 decades, Beltracchi and his wife Helene created a strong sales network to sell paintings forged and faked by Beltracchi. They relied on Helene's ancestry via her industrialist grandfather, Werner Jaeger, and a famous art collection they claimed Helene's grandfather had amassed in secret by buying works at low prices from a Jewish dealer shortly after the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. They even staged historical photographs of Helene in period costume with forged artworks in the background to contribute to this created provenance. And during this time, not only did Beltracchi successfully forge and sell paintings and drawings for 40 years, he claims about 300 works from the period of 1970 to 2010, which is just completely unfathomable. Beltracchi also fooled some leading experts and institutions in his scheme, but in the end, some of the contributing factors to Beltracchi's demise was the question of verifying your provenance and your documentation, specifically as it relates to the verso or backs of paintings. So moving in a bit closer to this story, part of the fabricated provenance that Beltracchi created was the claim that this Jewish dealer that they acquired the works from was none other than the gallerist Alfred Fleckheim. Now, Gallery Fleckheim was largely seized and Aryanized by the Nazis in the 1930s, which spells for us doing research, plunder, and erasure, and many of their records did not survive World War II. However, what we do know is that Gallery Fleckheim was known to have affixed verso labels to many of the works that they exhibited and sold. And all of these factors leave quite a few gaping holes in which someone like Beltracchi could create a compelling story, and that's exactly what he did. So over the course of this long con, Wolfgang began affixing his own Sammlung Fleckheim labels to the backs of paintings, and I say by artists such as Heinrich Campendock and Max Ernst. As you can see here, these labels, the label on the left, they were decorated with a cartoonish rendering of Alfred Fleckheim himself and were intended to bolster the provenance story Helene and Wolfgang had crafted around the Jaeger's collection. However, the Beltracchi's version of the label looks nothing like any of the known originals. Now, this is just a sampling of a few of the Gallery Fleckheim labels that exist. More can be found on the Alfred Fleckheim website, which gives a lot more detail about Fleckheim's career as a dealer and the labels and how to kind of traverse the many documents related to his doing research on a piece that traversed through Gallery Fleckheim. Ultimately, scientific testing proved that these labels, or the Beltraki labels, were affixed with modern day glue and the paper was artificially aged. However, if you're working in today's 21st century research methodologies, your due diligence efforts combined with the familiarity of verso labels from gallery Flecktime should raise an authenticity red flag for you if you encounter them on a painting you're researching. And, I know that this Beltraki example may feel like an extreme example. On one side of that spectrum, I don't want us to forget that Beltraki has only been prosecuted for a small fraction of the work that he's claimed to have created. But at the other side of that spectrum, I want us to think about really taking the time of not necessarily trusting the sources of your research until you've also made sure that it's been verified. Because we do want to remember that Beltraki did fool a lot of leading experts and institutions, and that in part is something that was partially conditional upon the time in which he was originally creating these pieces. But as we move into the 21st, well, as we are in the 21st century now, we're not moving into it, we are in it. Digital resources have allowed us to reach a much wider network of research sources that we want to take advantage of. And we also want to make sure that whatever we do take the time to do investigative provenance research on is something where we have the capacity to understand not just the art historical implications of that piece, but the historical and social context of the time period in which this artwork has existed. What's going on in the locations in each place that it's been owned? Why might there be a gap in ownership? Has it been hidden? Is that a reason for some of the conservation damage? These are all questions that need to be taken into account when you're looking at the paperwork. So then going in the wrong direction. So I'd also like to kind of touch a bit upon other mediums. So with all mediums of art, it is important to maintain familiarity with the artist's practice and materials, because that is definitely also going to play into your understanding of the provenance and the research that you're conducting. With prints and multiples, it can definitely be very easy for people to try and augment the value of a print by applying signatures, numbering systems, or even hand-painted details. We've definitely seen this on more than one occasion in print markets for Picasso, Chagall, and Miro, but it's definitely something that runs the gambit of price points in the prints and multiples world. And another question to think about too, and this also plays into our understanding of value, our understanding of what is important about the ownership history, and also origins of source. Where did you buy this from? How does that play into our understanding of clean title and provenance? Is thinking about original versus posthumous production as just an example. And I think Auguste Rodin serves as a great example of this. So Rodin's estate is now represented by the Musée Rodin, and Rodin bequeathed much of his oeuvre to the state of France, including the right to reproduce his work following the artist's death. So that means that Musée Rodin does have the ability to cast new sculptures that are considered authentic Rodin works. However, these new casts, these new authentic reproductions, must meet 3 stipulations in order to be considered authentic by the Musée Rodin. So 1, the bronze proofs must be cast from a plaster or terracotta model made by Rodin personally. 2, the circulation of reproductions must be limited. French law limits the castings to 12 numbered editions. Usually you're going to have 1 through 8 that are the saleable editions, and then we have 4 proofs reserved for the cultural institutions to acquire. And more often than not, the Musée Rodin will keep one of those 4 proofs so that the French state collections can acquire those Rodin sculptures into the French state collection. Now, we're thinking about this. Okay, that seems, we have those 3 stipulations. That seems easy enough. But then let's also keep in mind that Rodin's oeuvre entered the public domain in 1982, which means it can be reproduced. However, it needs those reproductions, if they are legitimate reproductions, need to refrain from infringing on the Rodin estate's copyright and droit moral. And one of the primary ways to avoid that copyright infringement is to label the reproductions visibly as a reproduction or an aftercast. So that means it can't be written on the base. It needs to be readily legible and identifiable so no one can be fooled easily into thinking that the sculpture they're looking at is not original. Now, all of this, there's so many moving parts to this. So we have the 3 stipulations of how to make authentic reproductions. We have work that's in the public domain. And then we also have this idea of avoiding copyright infringement, which is also coupled with the fact that Rodin didn't really number his castings during his lifetime. And the example here that we have, the Kiss, there are some sources that suggest more than 300 casts of the Kiss were produced between 1898 and Rodin's death in 1917. So that makes it even harder to immediately recognize authentic or reproduction, right? And so then that again is going to play into our understanding of ownership history, source, questions of authenticity. So notably, right, we have that warning label there. The Musée Rodin even has a page on their website which is entitled "A Warning to Collectors About the Notion of Authenticity," which includes a note that there are a growing number of reproductions or aftercasts whose appearance fosters confusion with original casts authorized by the artist or the Musée Rodin. And they also note that these reproductions are often accompanied by certificates of authenticity. So ultimately, this example leads us to again discuss the need for familiarity with the artist and their materials. We need to maintain that familiarity with the pitfalls of the market and market, yes, market as a whole, but market for the specific artist or artwork you are working with. Again, always asking yourself, what does the market require for this piece? And then we also want to keep in mind the experts who may be able to assist in distinguishing reproduction for original or assist with talking about questions of authenticity. And in keeping with this example, it is important to note that the Musée Rodin does not authenticate works that they have not overseen the creation of. And you will, if you're working on a Rodin, you would need to get in touch with one of the other market respected authenticators or scholars for those pieces. And obviously I recognize, that we can't cover everything about the ins and outs of provenance during our lunch break, but I really appreciate everybody joining me here today and trying to do that. So in conclusion, I'd kind of like to leave everyone with a risk assessment that will help you in looking at how to build your provenance up and how to evaluate what you're looking at, regardless of the type of piece you're looking at. So our first question is, does the current owner have clean title? And the secondary question there automatically is, how do I recognize the passage of clean title? And the answer again is going to be your documentation and a detailed bulleted list. And now that we talked about it, private collection provenances will not indicate to you a transfer of clean title without reviewing the associated documentation. You should also verify that the documentation provided by your client is reliable and accurate. You also should verify that the client you're working with is reliable and accurate, and the people listed in the ownership history are reliable and accurate. And this also applies to provenance information derived from blockchain entries, which is something I wanted to touch on really quickly, specifically as it relates to secondary market works. And the questions that we have to keep in mind when we're looking again at a wonderful tool for helping us record data and keep track of that provenance data is who initially entered the information into the blockchain. When was the last time the historical provenance was reviewed or updated? Can you verify that provided provenance outside the blockchain? And just like any other form of documentation, let's remember that the blockchain at times is only as reliable as the person who entered the data. And additionally, clean title is important to consider because without clean title, an artwork may not be saleable. So again, relating back to the questions of appraisals, questions about clean title may indicate, right, that an opinion of value, depending on the project, should be impacted to reflect the appropriate marketplace. And then even further, when we're thinking about making sure the passage of clean title is ensured, if you're working with primary market works, what are you passing along to your clients? What are you passing along to buyers to help you build this trail of ownership and build this legacy of paperwork that will ensure provenance is easily and readily identifiable and confirmed down the line? Then our second question falls under the category of, is authenticity supported by provenance? So here, of course, the Knoedler scandal serves as a prime example of provenance not supporting authenticity. I think it's definitely an example many of us are very familiar with. And I know Center for Art Law has hosted a viewing of one of the documentaries made on the topic. And I'm sure that most people here have also by now watched the Netflix documentary Made You Look. So we'll think about kind of what not to do. But in thinking of what not to do, we want to think about a number of questions that relate to this topic. So, does the artwork appear in the reputable catalog raisonné? Again, IFAR is a great source to help identify the most reputable catalogs raisonné. If it's not in a catalog raisonné or a catalog raisonné does not exist, is there additional information that will support authenticity? Is the trail of ownership reliable enough to feel confident? Is it going to be included in an upcoming catalog raisonné? Has a reputable connoisseur issued an official opinion? Reputable being the key word here, and does scientific analysis support authenticity? Now, thinking back to the Renoir example that Irina talked about at the very beginning, that, those two lines of provenance are two questions that we may have, right? Which is a question of clean title. How did a painting go from 1877 to 1948 with no one in between? Are you talking to, and regardless of this piece being a work in a Russian collection, if you're talking to dealers or auction houses or collectors, and you're asking them, what is the provenance? And they say there is none, you really have to stop and say, okay, well, where's the paperwork to fill in these gaps? Because that is a big gap. And it's a disconcerting gap as well, right? Because we're looking at 1933 to the period after the war and the immediate aftermath of World War II, where a lot of looted art is circulating the market. So we want to keep that in mind. And then our last question is, should the valuation be influenced by available provenance information? And this is a question that needs to be asked based on whether or not the market for the artwork you are working on will accept the artwork with the provenance as presented in looking at authenticity, levels of available documentation, and gaps in ownership. Now, these are questions that may be difficult to answer for a lot of artworks, and they may not seem as important for certain markets. However, the answers to these questions can make or break an artwork's life on the secondary market. So if at any point you're looking to buy an artwork or are assisting a collector or client with their collection, I'd like you to always remember, yes, caveat emptor, buyer beware, but really always remember that your legacy starts with the paperwork, and really look into that paperwork if you're going to be doing the provenance research and due diligence to help you move along. And then I'd, love to open up our floor to questions with the time we have left.
Aubrey, thank you so much. We are starting to receive questions, and a couple of them are, you mentioned NFTs, so that's what sparked the first set of questions. How do you verify information on the blockchain, and is it possible to do so?
So I think the question of blockchain, right, we definitely have a level of anonymity that's going to come with the blockchain. There are some blockchains that allow you to put in who has conducted the provenance research for a secondary market work. And if you have access to that information, you're going to want to say to yourself, okay, is this person an experienced provenance researcher? Does this person have the expertise to be doing research on this piece? And that, is the first thing I would suggest, because there are a lot of people in the art market who claim to be experts in conducting research. And there are some examples that I've definitely come across where claims of provenance research have been made, and that provenance research process has been 3 hours on Google. So you want to make sure that if someone is claiming that they're a provenance researcher, that they have that background. And secondly, you may not necessarily be able to trace, as I see Lauren posting in here about using aliases and things like that, you might not be able to trace those specific owners on the blockchain using the aliases, but you do want to look at the information that is being put in association with the artwork and those exchanges. So for example, if you're looking at a secondary market work, let's say you're looking at a historical secondary market work, and let's say maybe we're looking at a Monet landscape, for example. There should be some level of documentation in there besides just the first 21st century owner to have entered that information into the blockchain, right? To have entered in that Monet landscape into the blockchain. We want to know, where was it before 2015 or whenever it was entered? What is the trajectory of it getting from the creation by Monet in the late 1800s to 2015? Do we have access to that information? When is the last time that information was updated in the blockchain? Because as we know, databases recording Nazi looted art are often being updated on a daily basis. New claims are coming forward. New archives are readily available to be accessed. So the question you want to ask yourself is, verifying the information, yes, that you can look at immediately within the blockchain, but also asking yourself, particularly for secondary market works, what information can I verify outside the blockchain to help me feel more comfortable with the information that is provided to me within the blockchain?
Aubrey, thank you. There are a few questions that I want to pose to you. For example, how do you, or how does one, not how do you, but what should appraisers theoretically do if they are faced with objects in a collection that raise red flags?
So I've definitely worked on a number of cases like this, so I can kind of use that as a framework. Normally, I would suggest that you notify your collector that there is a red flag, because ultimately, if there is a red flag, the scope of the appraisal project will most likely change. So you want to make sure that they're notified. You want to make sure that they're aware that the appraiser can go forward and either do more research themselves, or they can work with an expert to help do that research. However, sometimes collectors will not want you to, they will not want to pay for that research to be done, or they'll not want to undertake the time. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that it's very clear to the collector that, and probably even by noting it in your assumptions and kind of the fine print of your appraisal report, that there are red flags here, and the value listed on the report is an opinion assuming that the information that's been provided to them is true and that authenticity is correct. Because I've definitely worked on a number of cases with appraisers where there are historical appraisal reports for a piece, so numerous appraisal reports over the course of a number of years with specific values. But then they get into the point where they're trying to loan an object or resell an object, and the market will not accept it. So you may be paying insurance premiums for a blue chip piece for years, but then you go to sell it and the market says, well, this is not considered authentic, so we're not going to accept it. You also might get into a situation where the appraisal, you're using that appraisal, you're saying, I think I have clean title, and you go and loan it to an institution, and the institution won't accept it because it doesn't have the appropriate provenance in place. So the two options are either, again, sorry for being so long-winded, making sure that if your client doesn't want to move forward, you're making sure that they understand what it means and the implications of not wanting to move forward. And two, if you are given that opportunity, to make sure that you really are taking the time and helping them get the research and resources reviewed that they need to help justify any opinion of value that would be put on that piece.
In some instances, when an auction house receives a work of art that hasn't been vetted, finds there's a red flag, do they have any obligations, or are they are there any recommendations on choosing connoisseurs who are giving opinions? Are there certain organizations that certify appraisers or authenticators or provenance researchers?
So if you're looking for, okay, so there are like three different questions in here that I want to points I want to touch on. So yes, you might come to an auction house and a piece may not have been vetted, right? So there are different ways that an auction house can deal with that, definitely. So the auction house can choose to vet it themselves and move forward that way. If they don't feel comfortable vetting it, or they think there isn't enough information, or it's not worth their time, they may not vet it and they may just kind of send it back to you, at which point you might, if you're really interested in selling it or getting down to the bottom of it, I would suggest that you want to reach out to a provenance researcher, or depending on the question you're looking at, right? If you're looking at a question of authenticity, provenance research can also contribute to authenticity claims. So provenance research before you submit to an authentication committee can be very helpful for you, depending on the authentication committee, because then you're able to provide that backup of historical documentation to be looked at in conjunction with the connoisseurial aspects of the artwork itself. What you would want to do, I would suggest, if something has been rejected, is you want to look at You want to look at what the catalog, who's making the catalog raisonné as a great expert for questions of authenticity. Who's making the reputable catalog raisonné? Who's issuing official opinions that you're seeing referenced in auction catalogs and in museums and things like that? You want to be familiar with the artist and who is the official scholar on that subject. And then the third thing is about how do you kind of get to know who you're working with, right? So there is no organization to quote unquote certify provenance researchers or authenticators. So with provenance researchers, I would suggest that you want to look at someone who has advanced experience doing both art historical and historical research, because we don't want our provenance research to be tied up just in an understanding of the art market, because it is often also historical and social contexts that come into play. And we also want to, and then when we look at authenticators, like I mentioned, catalog raisonnés, who's making them, who's being referenced and cited as the expert. And then for appraisers in the US, there are definitely 3 organizations where people can be USPAP compliant, which means that you comply with the government standards for the uniform standards of professional appraisal practice. Now, I think it's important to note that you cannot be a certified appraiser in any of these groups. You don't get certified as an expert, but you are compliant, and you need to update that compliance every 2 years to remain compliant. And then those 3 groups are the AAA, the Appraisers Association of America, the ISA, the International Society of Appraisers, and the ASA, the American Society of Appraisers. And those 3 groups work across the United States. And I also know a number of my colleagues work internationally to help people put appraisals into motion. And that means that we have a very specific set of guidelines that we need to follow to make sure that our opinions are objective and meet market standards. And you have to be up to date to make sure that that you're meeting those standards regularly.
Thank you, Aubrey. There's a question which I would like to pose. The question is, if a museum discovers that they have property that was donated and it might have belonged to a questionable individual, what should a museum theoretically do in that instance? And I think the answer is it depends on the duties of the institutions, right? Mm-hmm. Similarly to the duties of researchers and appraisers. It depends on who is performing the research.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree. And I also think that we're seeing a lot more efforts of museums putting together provenance research departments or provenance research initiatives to make sure that pieces in their collection don't fall under those categories. But at the same time, we do see a lot of cases where claims may be made, and there are definitely fights to keep those pieces in the institutions especially when the case is not, cut and dry. And of course, it's always very difficult to say what about provenance and what about the legal case around a provenance claim is cut and dry. So there are definitely 2 sides to that coin.
Thank you very much. I'm looking if we have any other questions from the audience, and I'm sure everybody is welcome to contact Aubrey with questions and follow up with us after, if we can be of
definitely
assistance. I think one of the last question is about institutions or databases that are reliable for. I don't think there is one institution that is reliable. I think the moral of the story is you have to check your sources, and you have to do due diligence is not really fully defined. It's kind of, you ask your questions until you get the answers. And if there's a red flag, you continue getting to the bottom of it until you figure that there's no red flag, right? If the story is the object was created in 1917 and it was just sold, but it turns out that the artist who made it just died, then the gap doesn't really matter.
Right. But if an artwork was sold in 1917 and the artist died in 1850, then where is all of the paperwork that comes in between, right? It's about assessing your risk, knowing where to look, figuring out how to frame your questions, and basically following the leads, almost like a detective, until you get to the answer that you're looking for, which is clearing the red flag or not.
Thank you again. Thank you, Manelli, for making sure that we have the materials to share. There'll be a follow-up email going from the center with the handouts again and the slides, I'm sure, as well as questions or questionnaire. So please let us know which questions we might have answered already or which questions you still have unanswered. We're looking forward to seeing you again and again at the Center for Art Law in person and online. And indeed, there are wonderful events in the works. So just take a look at the calendar, and if your schedule permits, join us. Thank you all.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me.